Hello everyone, today we discuss the difference between the tree of life and the tree of knowledge in universal tradition. We'll look specifically at biblical exegesis, and we will also confront this with the myth of the Rex Nemorensis to draw some important distinctions between sort of approaches, if anything, to both Christianity, Judaism, and Indo-European tradition that is definitely a topic I know you're generally speaking interested in, and we're going to make a lot of this stuff in the future as well. Considering the composition of my videos, at this point, they're themes. We make a bit less Christian history than before, but it's not really wanted in the sense that we are stuffing the content with more specials, mostly about the history of the art of war. While on every weekend we cover these other topics that are somehow more universal in nature. But for those who don't know this, I really make a lot of Christian history content, right? Mostly medieval Christian history, but not only. We have plenty of stuff also about antiquity, and this probably is going to go, in fact, in the sort of ancient Christianity playlist, possibly. So I think this is really relevant as a topic to start with, especially looking at this distinction. We talked often about the Rex Nemorensis, the queen of the forest and the king of the forest in recent videos. So if you have already caught up with those, everything is really going to be easier, right? So we approach this from the side of the Ars Regia, right? And so essentially the hermetic practice known as this, and as the hidden transmission of so-called sons of Hermes, so to say, which is also the definitive purpose of alchemic practices, right? You have numerous hermetic texts directly equating also this general body of knowledge throughout the centuries in increasingly secular and modern ways. Sometimes you find the term magic, right? Sometimes even occult. But there is actually a big distinction we should make at some point from a theoretical point of view, because much of what we consider as occult was actually well within medieval Catholicism in ways that we never reason in these terms. I don't want to digress too much because we have really to talk about a lot of things, but I was thinking about this just before starting the video today, that we have an idea, at least of the idea of the decline of the empire. We don't necessarily think that it was an empire in the medieval West and all this kind of stuff, and we see in that sense through secularization, modernization, how that word somehow evaporated. Few people necessarily connect this with sort of the older beliefs also of the classical past, and traditionally referring also to a primordial era. And we sort of give for granted that instead what the church preserves today, if anything, also in an international posture in terms of church policy, that especially the papacy, the Vatican, etc., is fundamentally unchanged. Everything ever since, at least like the gradual layering around the core of the synoptic gospels, and especially from Nicaea, is even just scripturally and literally all that is needed to understand Christianity, to identify Christianity, right? Whereas to ancient medieval Christians, and partly even beyond, it was completely normal to contain within the broader Catholic arc, under the great Catholic cupola, a much broader sense and awareness of what that doctrine really meant in a traditional sense, in a traditional context. That is exactly what contemporary people have fundamentally completely missed. And I'm probably going to make at some point some more conceptual video explaining the degree of these boundaries, how we are fundamentally misthinking most of what we understand as religion, even on the basis of the same religious practice and body doctrine that in fact very few people actually bothered themselves to actually study and understand. Was it even a matter of vocabulary, of terminology, right? If you have a pretty good understanding of, I don't know, Latin, Hellenic, Hebrew, etymology, like you can, by itself, like probably discover a completely different explanation or meaning in this spiritual traditions, and not just in Christianity, but also starting, of course, for something that is culturally akin to the contemporary world for how it arrived today. Regarding a bit the entire concept and meaning of tradition was surely held by ancient medieval Christians, including, in fact, those that had been fundamentally converted from if anything, a pre-Christian past as well, where there is a massive continuum, and not, as most people believe, simply in a sort of dichotomic oppositional sense with a switch, right? These changes are much deeper, but also much more gradual, and there isn't quite necessarily a specific fracture, especially in the theological meaning and intention of these doctrines. This is not what we're going to talk about today, or we're at least indirectly exemplifying it today, right? And so when we look at alchemy in particular, and the Hermetic tradition, we're looking at a continuation in fact, and also a filtered one. There are very ancient texts talking about, in fact, Hermes Trismegistus, from a primordial concept of divinity, etc. That, however, especially the more alchemy took on a modern and somehow quote-unquote occult character, seems to play some sort of revelation, right? There is always the trick of Gnosticism, the error of reducing this to fundamentally just not much a mere knowledge, as we will understand today, but also as something that, in fact, it does not pretty much reject an holistic view of the universe, where, for example, spirit and matter are inextricably entwined, just like every Catholic belief, Christian and pre-Christian, held, in fact, dictating also before Christianity which cult was licit and which one was illicit, for example, in the Roman Empire. There were people burned at the stake also in the Roman Empire, also mostly for the good reasons. As a matter of fact, it continued also within Christianity. And this was valid actually for the entirety of the world. That's yet another thing that nobody really likes to talk about, because we believe that those things are, first of all, quote-unquote evil, without understanding why even they were done, and secondly, that was just a terrible Christian monotheistic thing. It wasn't, there isn't even a monotheism or polytheism. These are completely wrong, erroneous, modern secular terms that have nothing to do with tradition and what people at the time believed in. But there is this sense of course, more ancient core that you must be able to read, also through the metaphors, the allegories, especially the later texts, which actually has the same identical function of, for example, Christian scripture. In fact, let's go to the latter and let's reflect, considering what we already discussed on this channel regarding the Rex Nemorensis, the golden bow, etc., the account of the tree from Genesis 3:22-24. Let's simply read, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put out his hand and take also the tree of life and eat and live forever." Right? In this passage from the opening chapters of the book of Genesis, which recounts the events in the primordial Garden of Eden, where God planted every tree pleasant to the sight and good for food, including the specific tree of life positioned in the midst of the garden alongside the tree of good and evil, the divine words acknowledge humanity's acquired likeness to the divine beings through the act of eating the forbidden fruit from the latter tree. Right? The tree of life, instead, whose fruits were understood in ancient interpretive traditions as bestowing unending physical and spiritual vitality through direct, sustained communion with the divine presence that walked in the garden in the cool of the day, stands as the means by which that newly attained divine stature could have been anchored permanently into an immortal bodily condition, preventing the subsequent expulsion eastward from the garden and the placement of cherubim with a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life at that point. I would like to stress in this sense that in the canonical biblical text of Genesis 2:3, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the two trees are explicitly presented as distinct. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, from which Adam and Eve eat, gaining moral awareness, shame, and the consequences of disobedience, including mortality and expulsion, and the separate tree of life, whose fruit would confer ongoing mortality and sustain divine communion. Right? Genesis 3:22-24 directly follows the eating from the knowledge tree and states that God acts to prevent humanity from also reaching out to the life tree, eating its fruit and living forever in their now fallen state. Right? Know good and evil here means acquiring experimental discernment of moral opposites and the resulting rapturing relationship with God. Not omniscience, humanity gains a godlike capacity for judgment but loses unhindered access to divine life and presence. The fact that God, in this sense, perspectives focus on the fact, okay, well, so after the fall, humanity is separated from the accessibility to the tree of life, but this is an illusion because, as you see here, God places a cherubim at the guard of heaven, in the sense, in the tree of life, right? And as such, the idea being that if you could really elevate yourself to that status once again, by defeating the cherubim, otherwise there would have not really been a need for that. Like, had you just fallen by God's will and you could have not come back, there would have not been a need to guard the tree. Instead, this evidently shows that still humanity, but as truly mankind, can't come back to seize the tree of life. And this brings us back to the golden bow, because as we know, that absolute divinity can't be reacquired in the myth of the Rex Nemorensis, right? And so this means that also in the Old Testament, technically, regardless again of the Semitic filter, this very sort of this millenary sort of anticipation of moral collapse that occurs in the earlier Mesopotamian civilizations. This is something that is going to happen millennia later to the rest of the world. But essentially, by the age of Christ, nobody in the world believed you could save yourself by yourself. But when you read the Old Testament, you have to be aware, of course, that this is the specific saga, right? That the Jews filtered through their own current spiritual understanding and status, right? There are huge differences indeed through not much in the sense that the Semitic Bible per se, that, as we've seen also in the last video last week, even in Gilgamesh Epos, actually does show you that immortality was one step away fundamentally from being seized. Like, Gilgamesh literally takes a nap and loses the opportunity to become immortal. So none of these texts, right, even in the Semitic tradition, argue that in absolute terms, people can't achieve that. Of course, these are the top heroes, and as such, it's just like a metaphor that's done. If Gilgamesh couldn't do it, like, you can't do it yourself. And so it's more like an attitude, a postural, a moral issue. We also described how, for example, Judaism and Islam do not have anything like incarnation, right, and theosis per se. The point, though, is that Christianity does actually have it instead, and actually shows with Christ himself that immortality can be seized, right? And so the notion that Christianity would also carry some sort of Semitic guilt, today we'll talk about this, and that therefore is just like a Jewish product and sort of in a broader moral temper, is somehow incredibly debatable just due to the same foundation of Christianity here we hinted at, but that actually aligns with the same concept of theosis, incarnation, and Trinity that at least Indo-European religions fully had themselves, right? Today we will not talk about that. We'll not talk about how indeed there are different there's different wording, messaging. There's a different temper, different Christian message but it's also one based on radical spiritual reformation, right? And something not different from the attitude, for example, Buddhism had towards the Vedas, that in Zoroastrianism had towards the Avesta. In general, also with different outcomes, but still in this fundamental criticism of the current state of traditional reception from the side of humanity, side of mankind. It essentially tells you, hey, you can actually divinize, right? In Catholic Orthodox, you have clearly the idea of theosis based on Christian mimesis. So the point of being a Christian is to become God yourself, quite uncontroversially from a theological standpoint. But this is not either what we want to talk about for now, at least. Going back, in Jewish interpretive traditions spanning centuries, including extensive rabbinic commentaries and mystical writings such as those found in Midrashic literature and Kabbalistic texts, the aforementioned tree of life functions as a profound sacramental symbol of sustained divine communion and perpetual vitality within the primordial garden setting, right? So it is actually continues, as we'll see now, the exact sources preserved well within, in this sense, also Judaic Orthodoxy, right, and Veterotestamentary tradition in any case, deliberately distinguishing from the tree of knowledge specifically to highlight humanity's original unhindered access to eternal fellowship with the divine before the expulsion. So this is particularly interesting because it's not much a matter of some sort of human form created in a cage that is simply forbidden by God to access something, right? Otherwise, this omnipotence would have manifested in, okay, you can't even literally go as near as the tree, right? We know how things went differently. So we'll understand better now what that means, because the Garden of Eden, in this sense, is still considered as, from a human perspective, the moment in which humanity was in full plenitude with God, and so with the world, where everything was undistinguished in practice, regardless of the anthropomorphization, the sort of naturalization of this Eden, literally in the older sort of Bronze Age Hebrew mentality, right? That could be more or less, in fact, sort of transcending in imagery and in words. So that's a completely different idea. We have to understand what undergirds that theological concept to begin with, that is much more absolute, all right? Now, these traditions, drawing directly from the scriptural narrative in its expansions in texts like the Book of Jubilees or Aramaic retellings such as the Genesis Apocryphon, recovered from Qumran, portray the tree of life as the axis of ongoing divine blessing and a life-giving presence, contrasting its role with the tree of knowledge, whose fruit introduced moral discernment accompanied by mortality and toil, thereby emphasizing the pre-expulsion state where humanity enjoyed actually unmediated access to the divine source of vitality in the garden's fertile, well-watered environment. I would like to stress, by the way, that yes, in both mainstream Judaism and I hate the term mainstream, by the way, and Christianity, the idea that the tree of life was present, freely accessible in the Garden of Eden before the fall is a standard orthodox part of the narrative, right? There are many examples of this: Genesis 2:8-9 to 16, post-fall. In the pre-fall state, if you look at the theology of it, regarding informant, Genesis 3:22-24, right? It's also important to stress, however, that the texts that we just mentioned here, the Book of Jubilees and the Genesis Apocryphon, are not considered orthodox, right? Canonical or authoritative texts in mainstream rabbinic Judaism in particular. And with distinctions, because the Book of Jubilees is not canonical in any major branch of Judaism, say either Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, etc. It is classified as pseudo-pigrapha, as Second Temple period, roughly mid-2nd century BC, rewriting / expansion of Genesis and part of Exodus, right? It was popular among certain groups like the Essenes, likely associated with, in fact, the Qumran community that preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls, that in fact we mentioned, where multiple copies were found. In fact, only, however, the Ethiopian Jewish community, the Beta Israel / Haymanot, and the Ethiopian / Eritrean Orthodox churches treated as canonical. So you want to appreciate there is also a Christian branch of this. Rabbinic sources, Mishnah, Talmud, etc., do not cite it as scripture, though some later Midrashic traditions preserve echoes of its interpretations. And here we do not digress particularly with the rest of the content, right? But as far as the Genesis Apocryphon, this is even more heterodox, so to say, in a canonic sense. But this is the contrast I want to stress, that while these texts are not canonic in these religions, still the concept aligns, right? The tree of life being in pre-fall heaven, and so in everything that existed at that point, as immediately present and in this sense also accessible, right, in the Garden of Eden, is both part of Christianity and Judaism, right? The Genesis Apocryphon is, again, a Qumran-specific text, one Capgen, an Aramaic paraphrase embellishment of Genesis stories focusing on Lamech, Noah, and Abraham, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not canonical in any form of Judaism. It's pseudo-epigraphal, retelling valued for insights into Second Temple interpretive traditions and Aramaic language, but it has no authoritative status in rabbinic literature. Like Jubilees, it reflects the interests of the Qumran sect, often, again, identified with Essenes, and shows similarities to other non-canonical works. Now, needless to say, the Tree of Life is identified by scholars as one of the most polyvalent symbols in biblical literature, representing not only immortality through direct relationship with God, but also wisdom, Torah itself as a source of life-giving instruction, and the future hope of restored creation, where it reappears bearing healing fruits. Right? For example, in Kabbalah, it corresponds, here we're talking mostly Jewish tradition, to the diagrammatic structure of the 10 Sephirot emanations, mapping divine attributes and the soul's ascent, right? So it's part of a wall. You could argue a Catholic wall hadn't, we should define what, I've been emailed about this, like say, well, what do you consider Catholic? In a broader sense, right? Of course, any universal tradition is Catholic, right? And of course, there are some aspects in these other Jewish currents that, of course, stress that sense of elevation, etc. But remember that in Judaism, there is no such thing, as I was saying before, as incarnation. And so theosis, as such, the Spirit of God can descend in you and fight even with you. This is to be found in the Old Testament in military context, for example. This is not present in Islam, right? But fundamentally, everything is a God's decision, right? Whether you win or accomplish whatever, it's you have agency, but whether this has a consequence, it's mediated, right? Not simply reflected by God, like in Christianity or in Indo-European tradition, for example. In Islam, it's just merely God wants it or not, and you practically have no specific capacity of transcendence, even in an inner sort of divine, with a seizure, right, of divine might. Now, while ancient Near Eastern parallels link the Tree of Life to stylized sacred trees or poles associated with fertility, agricultural bounty, and goddess iconography, such as Asherah poles or Mesopotamian motifs of cosmic vitality. Remember, just like in the Rex Nemorensis in the Latin Saga, the Tree of Life, of course, is the Queen of the Forest, the symbol of Mother Nature, Mother Earth, that needs to be seized in a victorious fashion. And we've seen, again, in last week, how, in the sense, the hero in the Semitic tradition is challenged by by goddesses that make him fail, whereas this is not the case in Western tradition. Instead, right? The fruits of the tree of life were imagined as bestowing unending life in God's presence, as later echoed in wisdom literature such as the Book of Proverbs, where you do find, in fact, this idea of a tree of life composed in the tradition of Solomonic sayings that personify wisdom as a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. So quite explicitly drawing back to that parallelism of seizure, right? Where it embodies practical insight, realized aspirations, moral stability, and the path to longevity and favor with God, and culminating in apocalyptic visions of the Book of Revelation, written in the late 1st century AD as a prophetic unveiling, where the tree of life reemerges in the restored celestial New Jerusalem beside the pure river of the water of life, clear as crystal proceeding from the throne of God and of the Lamb, providing 12 kinds of fruits, yielding every month for the healing of the nations. Right? This is incredibly important because it does actually speak of a pretty broader universal belief, because you would think, but the 12 nations is maybe the actually 12 tribes of Israel. No, it actually refers to the entirety of mankind. The 12 nations here, quite clearly, fruits yielding every month for the healing of the nations. Revelation 22:2 refers to all nations, peoples. The Hellenic is ethne, used in the eschatological New Jerusalem, not limited to the tribes of Israel. Right? Revelation envisions a universal restoration. A tree of life provides healing for the gathered nations, the Gentiles as well, who walk by the light of the city, with kings bringing their glory into it. Right? It echoes prophetic hopes like Isaiah's of global ingathering and healing beyond ethnic Israel, while the 12 tribes and apostles frame the city's structure. In context, it symbolizes complete redemption and access to divine life for humanity post-judgment. And so this is the most important point in the association with the tree of life itself, right? This is, again, incredibly important. So Christianity, as we were saying, not just embraces the full concept of Trinity, incarnation, theosis, but in this sense, go past the Jewish ethnic centrality. It speaks of full universal healing, and as a consequence, and unavoidably in a theological sense, also outside of Judaism, outside of Christianity, and in fact all the proper Catholic traditions of the world, truly passing through the accessibility of the tree of life that was recognized, in this case especially in Christian tradition, as specifically accessible to humanity, mankind, say, as it was dignified in heaven before the fall, and the fact that this will actually come back, and obviously through Christ and through God, but in this sense, having men partaking, right, this as well. And so there is an overlapping of man and God, and the medium, so to say. So you have actually a Trinitarian concept. I don't know how much it's been theologically, probably much, explored in this sense, but it actually speaks of the same identical God, Holy Ghost, you can argue Hermes Trismegistus, and the Son himself that fully returns to divine plenitude and fixes the world entire, as you understand. Right? So, incredibly important passage that I think every person, again, arguing that this is merely a matter of Judaism or Jewish identity or some sort of non-universal and alien, and we already talked about where Catholicism stands on the quote-unquote Oriental influence of Christianity. There is a reason if for thousands of years Europeans embraced this faith. Back to Genesis 3:22-24, a scriptural passage exposes two separate elements. First, a direct acknowledgement of the genuine divine stature that Adam successfully seized regardless of his eventual failure. And second, a clear reference to the latent potential for anchoring this elevated state within the universal current of power symbolized by the tree of life, which would have fixed his divinity permanently in an immortal condition. The divine plural that we read at the beginning, quote, one of us, is the declaration reflecting the heavenly court or assembly of divine beings participating in the creative and judgmental processes, affirming that the acquisition of knowledge elevated humanity toward that divine likeness in a real, not merely metaphorical manner, even as the subsequent measures address the risk of external fixation of that state to the tree of life's sustaining power. So not full divinity, but a part of that, right? So the myth, therefore, tells us figuratively of an event that carries fundamental risk and uncertainty to a higher axis, right? And in this sense, also in an imperfect way. There's something that's been broken in the celestial vault due to essentially a misalignment between our conscious and, in the sense, active capacity that, however, while containing a degree of divine power, does not fully access to the divine, and especially is even more distant, in a sense, from the tree of life than it had been before, because the fall has occurred, right? So it's as if to say that the presumption of knowledge alone, and so of Gnosticism, is a double-edged weapon, right? And it's fundamentally incompatible, or at least imperfect by definition, as it's based on gnosis just per se. In fact, what you see in all the various Gnostic heresies is dualism, right? The real problem of Gnosticism is not merely the idea that you can basically achieve divinity just through some body knowledge per se, but the fact that this is separated from the active transfiguration of the world through action and through, in fact, the full synthesis with being, right, in an absolute sense, but also in the sense with sort of the physical world as we understand it. And so it's a presumption to be able to fix the world merely through some idea of knowledge without action. Or you can't achieve that merely through contemplative ways. It can be, in theory, done, but if, curiously enough, and surprisingly in this sense, all Gnostic heresies contain a separation between the spirit and matter, which is the fundamental issue. It's not much a gnoseologic presumption that is wrong in Gnosticism, and how this fundamentally and imperfectly sees the world in an incomplete way, by definition, by foundation. This is the most pernicious threat of Gnosticism. It's dualistic, it's fractal misunderstanding of reality, of existence in particular. We will come back on this because there is plenty of sort of good videos we can make on Gnosticism as well. We already made lots of videos about this. I was forgetting something here. Okay, we'll come back on it in a way. Yes, I was thinking, as we'll see now, at also how Protestantism fundamentally adopted this Gnostic attitude in the measure by which works are truly understood to be relevant. That's fundamentally the same metaphysical misalignment, and also a more defeatistic moral stance. Now, in broader ancient interpretations, this motive that we just described underscored humanity's forfeited potential, in fact, for perpetual dependence on divine grace. In other words, right, the idea is that you could simply believe that, as many people actually do, both believers and non-believers, that faith entails merely some kind of knowledge, right? Because where do you draw the line otherwise, right? If you truly believe, what does that actually mean, right? There's the Peterson meme that last year I made By the way, I sent a letter to Jordan Peterson the same day which he went to the hospital. Maybe I was the actual metaphysical cause of this. But jokes aside, like, it would be really interesting to see him come back in this political circumstances. But in any case, because I don't think he's fully aware of many aspects of tradition, but there are also reasons here. I don't want to digress on it. But just imagine the amplification of this could be expanded via Schwerpunkt, so with some greater acknowledgement of the channel. But it's unrealistic considering not just the current situation, but in general, so what kind of role Peterson had. This is not important. The point here is presuming, in fact, that grace can arrive just by wishful thinking, right? This is exactly what figures like the Protestant reformer John Calvin, that did not really do a great deal of, good to humanity, in his 16th century commentaries on Genesis, interpreting the tree sacramentally as a signpost of reliance on God's sustaining provision rather than any inherent biological immortality independent of that ongoing relationship, right? Because how do you see this otherwise, right? As we've seen in the myth of Rex Nemorensis, there is, as we'll see better now, a substitution to divinity, renovatio of divinity. And if you think about it, and it's also a divinity that is bestowed on the same divine by its own inner logic to he who is worth of it. And if you think about that, the fall from heaven seems to suggest exactly this, that divinity is something really beyond the idea that, as we were saying before, the simply sort of anthropomorphistic understanding of a God that, again, simply forbids you to access this or that. Eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge is just the act of imperfection, the knowledge of what, essentially, of the possibility of your mortality. That would have not been thought otherwise. So fear and death, and mortality in particular. Whereas in that sense, the tree of life was lorded over by God in order for that full plenitude, as we've seen in the Rex Nemorensis, to occur in the entire forest, in the entire heaven, in the Golden Age, right? So as Protestantism denies value of works and therefore removes any heroic capacity connected with that, so Gnosticism, in a different way, in a more sort of proactive sense, but still a doctrinally erroneous one, promised you divinity simply by some sort of cerebral process that has nothing to do with the achievement of biological immortality that the same Christian and evidently also same also veterotestamentary only scriptures are telling you, look, that was feasible, that was achievable, and it also gives you this pathway to what has actually gone wrong. What has gone wrong is not much that humanity has accessed the tree of life that was forbidden to him. No. What has been forbidden was the tree of knowledge. And so this can be read in sort of by flipping the perspective as a specific bias and presumption that humanity has in its instantiation in the fall itself. I can't stress enough how important this is. Only the tree of knowledge of good and evil was forbidden to Adam and Eve. Right? In the account provided in Genesis, the instructions regarding the trees in the Garden of Eden are as follows. The tree of knowledge of good and evil, God explicitly commanded Adam not to eat from this tree, warning that doing so would lead to death. And that's actually the point of evil, fear of your mortality, right? With the tree of life, there was no potential prohibition against eating from the tree of life. In fact, God stated that Adam and Eve were free to eat from, quote, every tree of the garden except for the one tree of knowledge, right? This is incredibly interesting. Obviously, enough, we don't have here the whole sort of idea of what this prohibition in particular means per se, but indeed, it shows you in a providential sense how the ideation of one's mortality is the only cause of mortality. Because this is the tree of knowledge, right? This is not something else. It's not something merely bodily or constitutive. Because especially if you can simply already access the tree of life, there's literally no limit to that already. Nobody died in heaven. This is incredibly, incredibly important, right? In the Hesiodic theomachies, and typically in the saga of the Forest King, gods or transcendent men appear as holders of a power that can't pass, together with the attribute of divinity to whoever knows how to seize it, right? Consider this as far as the Garden of Eden as the earthly paradise. We've seen also in the videos about the German kings, the slumbering German monarchs, they're about to return. It said, what's the point? Is that the great tree is despoiled, that order on earth is broken. When the emperor resurrects, tree of life bears new fruits. So the problem here is that divinity is understood as a principle can restore that, right? And we're not going here to explain how the Trinity explains it sufficiently enough when we talk about sacred royalty and how we understand the achievement of that higher. Say, what does it mean? What does God mean specifically? It's not the scope, obviously, of today's video or any other single video, but it's incredibly relevant to show that this is not some place or some non-place or a metaphorical allegory. It means that the earth in which we live is to be restored in its prime order. Remember Virgil's fourth eclogue, the concept of Roman heaven, what that was to look like. Essentially the golden age, just like in the Garden of Eden. Hesiod's theogony, composed around the late 8th to early 7th century BC, quite early, archaic Hellas, in dactylic hexameter, as a genealogical account of the gods from primordial chaos through Gaia, Uranus, the Titans, and the Olympian victory under Zeus, details cosmic genealogies and successions of divine rule involving rebellion, inheritance of kingship, castration of fathers, swallowing of offspring, and the precarious transmission of sovereign authority that echo wider Indo-European patterns of cosmic order, challenged by cultural heroes who seize or inherit divine prerogatives through cunning, strength, or alliance. All right, so we'll see now where we get with this, but we often quote Hesiod, and the point of his work is that there's actually a quite Pelasgian chthonic dimension to it, right? These are all mixed bags when it comes to what kind of prevalence that we talk a lot about Dorian, Hellas, and how an Uranian, Apollonian form was imposed on this most chtonically, the sense earthly, rich, but substance rich but formless pre-Indo-European world was, or barely pre-Indo-European in any case. And Hesiod's theogony blends layers, for sure. It features strong chthonic elements. For example, Gaia, Earth as primordial mother, Titans as older power, succession via castration and rebellion, echoing, in fact, pre-Hellenic Pelasgian or Levantine influences like Hurrian, Kumarbi myths, that again were also, regardless of Indo-European influences there, too had been potently influenced by the Semitic spirituality that, as we again seen last week, show like Phaedra the here in front of the woman, right? The Olympian victory under Zeus obviously imposes also in Hesiod a more ordered, patriarchal, sky-oriented, so Uranian structure. Dorian and Hellenic traditions often emphasize the Olympian patriarchal side, while older Pelasgian or Minoan Mycenaean strata leaned more earth mother vegetative. All right, and this were already mixed in, Indo-European population, pre-Indo-European populations, and even when sort of the higher Uranian dimension of this world was in charge, still we see in Mycenaean palaces there were priestesses, for example, something that in later Dorian times were not a thing. because it was a radically more restricted role of the woman, following the Apollonian slaying of Python. But it's important because Hesiod is a deeply important source for the understanding of the primordia. And, we stay by, especially look at this early date that tells you how already powerful like Pelasgian influences were once again in Dorian Hellas, but still how powerful this myth's chthonic power and temptation really was. Prometheus, the titan who shaped humanity from clay and bestowed fire, representing knowledge and civilization despite Zeus's opposition, embodies the defiant bringer of arts and sciences in Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days. Punished by eternal torment from an eagle, in fact devouring his regenerating liver, yet ultimately liberated by Heracles, in various traditions, mirroring broader Indo-European, but also Levantine motives of culture, heroes who challenge cosmic order for the benefit of mortals through cunning and rebellion against tyrannical divine authority, or tyrannically perceived in that sense. If you think about it, as God punishes Adam and Eve for their sin, Christ redeems them. Right, and in this sense, as a hero, shows them the way to heaven, right? Prometheus is fixed by Heracles, and Heracles is, as you know, in the Dorian cycle, the actual only guy that transcends into heaven. So does this remind you of something, right? The idea of this knowledge, of this partial illusion that, I don't know, Gnosticism or technology or whatever can save you, even though can give you an edge by a degree, but not full salvation. It is actually played in a very specific heroic fashion with self-sacrifice. Thus, this is a very similar pattern. Prometheus's gifts included not only fire stolen from the gods, and you understand also how brutally Prometheus was punished, right? He's truly like at the lowest, right? But he's also unleashed at some point. So this is interesting because it suggests that the heroic sacrifice can redeem the entirety of the world, right? But let's not necessarily even go that far in Christian in the sense here, Hellenic comparison. But as an archetype is obviously parallel to many other religions, traditional branches. Prometheus's gifts included not only fire, stolen from the god's workshop on Olympus and carried in a hollow fennel stalk, but the full spectrum of civilizing arts, including writing, mathematics, astronomy, navigation, medicine, metallurgy, and the skills of sacrifice and foresight, all transmitted in defiance of the Olympian order, making him the archetypal initiator of human progress through forbidden knowledge, with parallels in trickster figures across Eurasian myths and even potential echoes in, indeed, Germanic lore involving Loki. It was all interconnected. On top of that, you know that the Asgard basically collapses. It's subject to destruction to Ragnarok because the same Aesir have employed the Nibelungs in order to erect it, so that there it's taken from another perspective, but it's fundamentally the same. There is a sin of Gnostic, technologistic kind that is committed by the same gods after all, right? And in the sense, if you consider the status of Adam and Eve, like that would default a bit the same pattern. A matching symbolic trajectory appears in Phrygian rites, where devoted participants lamented Attis as a, quote, green stalk cut down before maturity, because his sudden loss of generative capacity corresponds directly to being forcibly banished from the, quote, mighty tree at the center of paradise, and mirrors Prometheus being bound and chained to the mountain peak. Attis, the Phrygian vegetation deity associated with the Great Mother Cybele, whose self-castration and death rebirth cycle, detailed in Anatolian cult practices and later adopted in Hellenistic and Roman context, symbolize seasonal renewal, the cutting and regrowth of vegetation, and mystical union with divine feminine. So, in this case, providing a ritual framework for initiates seeking transcendence through symbolic death and regeneration, but belonging to the most Pelasgian chthonic vibe possibly ever. Right? Any kind of that kind of proper regeneration that is not a continuative generation, but just being continuously swallowed and sort of chewed, digested, and re-expelled in a lower form in this spiraling down in the samsara is typical of the per-Indo-European cult, right? The more something is regenerative in a non-absolute, in this sense, fully divinely achieving sense, a bit like Hercules, this is not full divinity. It's actually the degree by which you are in possession of a chthonic cult. But in any case, in fact, for telling you how truly similar even to Gnostic Cathars, for example, this stuff was. This cult involved ecstatic rites with eunuch priests known as Galli performing ritual self-flagellation and castration during annual spring festivals, such as those marking the vernal equinox, that mourned his death under a pine tree before celebrating his resurrection tied to fertility rites, often featuring the taurobolium, a blood baptism where initiates stood in a pit beneath a sacrifice bull whose blood flowed over them for purification and renewal, right? Along with processions carrying sacred trees draped in wool, frenzied music from timpana drums and flutes, and blood offerings that enacted themes of sacrifice, rebirth, and union with the maternal divine force central to Phrygian. And in part later, the Magna Mater worship that was even brought as in the great feudal compaction of this subordinated subject elements on the Palatine Hill in Rome. Even though this is the beauty of this sort of cultural space, is that, of course, in Rome, in Italy, even these chthonic deities were not just understood as subordinated, but in a much more traumatically and rigidly patriarchal, Uranian, Apollonian Catholic dimension of world domination, right? The cult of Cybele, again, known, and you have all these Levantine elements to that. They were mixed, again, also with some Indo-European superstratum in certain cases. The Magna Mater, that's the name for Rome, this cult had both dimensions, varying by context. The Anatolian Phrygian origins were ecstatic and intense, as we explained here. When officially adopted in Rome in 204 BC during the Punic Wars, the state cult on the Palatine was more regulated and austere in public practice, emphasizing Roman pietas, fertility for the empire, and civic order. It was like bringing this great mother of the East subjected to the Uranian, Romulian, patriarchal direction, right? Romanov, that wasn't all that kind of, the castration, self-flagellation, etc., right? That belonged to lesser people, like, also the Cathars and so on, that wanted to destroy their bodies, reject sexuality. We made lots of videos about what they actually were about. And you see how Gnosticism is basically always the same. In fact, Roman authorities did sometimes restrict the more extreme Asiatic aspects. What remained was the maternal, regenerative power in a somatic, substantial sense, subordinated to rigid patriarchal form, right? And indeed, the Italics were much more conservative, obviously still thought in part that this was a more sort of debauched cult, right? It was a popular perception of that level of Dionysian femininity, etc. But it was fundamentally a great matter of fertility, renewal, religion, blending austerity, state patronage with chthonic essences in Rome. I also made a video about the Magna Mater of Paesinus that spread, in fact, among the fourth estate proletarian legionnaires of Marius. That was also, as you know, as a popularius, more inclined toward that more chthonic dimension, at least support toward this more during his reform, of course, having soldiers accessing from all straight of Roman citizenry, right? And not because these were fundamentally just tied to the Magna Mater, but it was just like, I don't know, being a liberal at the time in the political debate as opposed to the more conservative one. And it would be interesting to study how much, in fact, these cults were spread among legionnaires, depending on also which kind of warlord, so-called, summoned them at some point. Now, the interpretation of the aforementioned Genesis passage has given life to some sort of misconception that especially belong to the mystical fascists that looked at this as saying, well, look, this story is basically a way of saying, like, they were even winking at some point toward the Gnostics. But it depends also on which figures we're talking about. Today, we're not sent as far as that, but so the idea is that this Jewish God basically is preventing humanity from divinizing once again. This is a mistake on so many levels, meaning that even if that were true, and we can't understand their fully in a providential, fully divine sense how that is, like the same Indo-European myth of the golden bow, the Rex Nemorensis and so on, is the same thing, right? There is a level of divinity that either bestows or at least is to set a standard for that access to divinity in the renewal of the cycle, right? So this can absolutely be attributed to the Old Testament review as well, right? If we especially understand that, as we've seen from the same Genesis passage, it's actually stated, aside from Revelation and so the Christian branch of it, but even in the Jewish part, like we do actually have the realization that men can reacquire that divinity, that you need a cherubim guarding the tree of life and so on. So there are always barriers in the same saga of the Rex Nemorensis. There is the citadel, there is the great oak, for example, on Capitol Hill, for example. It's present in all traditions with this level of, you have to achieve that. You can't simply walk into that. You have to challenge he who is holding divine power at that moment, right? So there is no doubt that the Old Testament filters this through a sort of more like subordinated position from a human side toward God, that however helps mankind to come closer to him as well. And that's also another story. We'll see if anything in a video on the Old Testament or something. But again, some scholars wanted to see a heroic, magical, and a religious divide. And it's forcing the interpretation. The bias does exist, is undeniable, but the theological underpinning is the same. And all traditions basically carry this idea. That's why, for example, Gnosticism truly doesn't pertain to tradition, because it's a rigging of this myth. All right. So according to the heroic version, let's put it in this way, that would be one who falls in the myth is simply a being whose fortune and strength were not equal to his audacity. Right? But according to the religious view, the meaning changes. And so misfortune turns into guilt, the heroic enterprise into a sacrilegious and cursed act, not because it ended in failure, but in itself. This is not what we simply see. At least we should reflect on who is he who actually fails, right? And also what other traditions say, because also, you know, in the Indo-European sagas, the hero sometimes, it's like saying, I don't know, that in the Germanic saga, Siegfried, by failing, would be already the symbol of somebody who had objectively sinned at the beginning, had sort of gained an important position to a trick fundamentally, and eventually pays for that. And because of the discord he had solved himself, or also that is for the Nibelungenlied, but say also the leaf during the bath in the dragon's blood, that also recurs here with the theme of regeneration, which is the same idea of Achilles holy water immersion except for the heel. So, all that sort of blind spot, it basically ends up ruining you, because if you go so high, but you are sinful, you are incomplete, the more ruinous your fall really is. This is what happens with Lucifer. We will talk about it now as the greater hero that becomes indeed in the Bible the epitome of the most reprehensible. But the problem is also what actually happens next. And for some religions, we don't, especially the Indo-European ones, we know only up to an extent, right? For Heracles, for example, he actually also fails, but there is a divine intervention. He actually makes it into heaven. Probably the Dorian original. However, this was conceptualized, made him literally winning, right? And in a truly, in fact, uncanny sense, we'll look at Hercules' myth better, because, as you know, he was fundamentally poisoned by yet another, his wife, right? So there is always the theme of the contrast that he also had, just like Apollo with Hera, with all the various labors of Hercules, as we explained, were aiming at organizing a fallen world, like taming chthonic monstrosity at Similia. The point being that whoever fails, of course, carries a guilt. This is the point that was made by some scholars, that guilt would be just an idea of the Semitic world, and that in the Indo-European one would be none of that. And that in the European world, if you just failed, you could simply try again. This is inconsistent in a theological sense, aside from the fact that we do continuously see in the European peoples that actually acknowledge, in terms of self-sacrifice, for example, when a commander failed, that they would have to fall on the sword. At some point, it was this idea that you were fundamentally responsible for a catastrophe. This is to be saying, think about Decius Mus, or look at even Varus at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. Interestingly enough, when you look, for example, at the Carthaginians that brought this more Levantine vibe, those used to put to death the failing generals by themselves. And so this more judging and sort of imposed idea of how this divine justice must be exacted. But it's obvious that just like in the fall, you have basically reduced yourself to a mortal status because of none other than your own fault, because who is making you mortal, right? You're supposed to be God, right? So the equally a guilt that is also instantiated in the degree by which you suffer after your failure is simply there, and it's fundamentally dictated by your own mental weakness, by your own existential, metaphysical incapacity of transcending yourself. And there is no doubt that there is this moment of redemption that is very deep and important in the Indo-European world. Think about Romanity, that in this sense was much more truly based on this idea that you could give the chance of those who were from the lower side to be transfigured within a patriarchal hierarchy, which has happened with the patricians extending citizenship and therefore military service. Actually, we've seen it in Camillian reforms in the 4th century that makes Rome taking over the world, but also in Christianity that tells you literally that death can be transcended, but there is no doubt that you have to atone for your sins. Right? And if you did something wrong, you have at least to learn from that, and you pay a price in the meanwhile, which is theologically understood as the very reason why you age, for example, is that you constantly sin. Right? Sin is not something that is also in biblical tradition was simply imposed on Adam and Eve. This is what, again, the bias of that Semitic background described as literally God kicking them out of the earthly paradise and whatever. But if you think about it, this is because they have acquired something and they keep feeling that sentiment of shame, of reduction themselves. This is on them, and as we've seen just also from the same Genesis, this is something that humans are seen as, now also as mortals, fully having acquired distinct agency from God even, right, as an offshoot of the same, which is incredibly consistent, for example, with Neoplatonism, with Plotinus made multiple videos on that, and in that plenitude of later, especially antiquity, idea of an imperial Catholic tradition as this last sort of big wave of the universal empire truly extended to an ecumenic scale, right? So sin is not a curse, or better, it is actually a curse as well, because it's transgenerational. It lives in your own, in that only sense you're regenerated as begotten, right? And until you pay for the sin of that line that lives through you biologically and metaphysically, you are bound to pay for that in any case. And you constantly pay by that, but as all these beings are constantly and actively sinning, because they carry this continuous spiritual condition that could and should be, and this is what tradition looks at fundamentally, be surpassed, be transcended through the reactivation of this awareness of how to achieve divinity, right? And so I would like to stress how modern and secular the view of a stigma of some external force, it's a superstition fundamentally, attributing to you a guilt and pretending that, I don't know, there is religions that think that you come out as a guilt as if you weren't mortal, actually. And it is true, you aren't mortal, you decide to be mortal, but that's the reason why you actually die. Because I don't know if you've ever met somebody who actually didn't or wouldn't die, right? And so that's something that you have to give an answer to, because that's the condition in which we find ourselves in. And so you must give an answer to why that is the case, right? This is not just a hero killing himself by saying, okay, I'm such a sinner, I killed myself on top of it. No, you're actively dying through aging and errors and mistakes because you do not know better, right? And the fault is yours because you actively don't know better. You don't do anything to do anything better. You stop to some incompleteness that brings you also to death, because if you're not God, you're not immortal. And so anything less than that makes you mortal. That's also the reason why, for example, through the generational successions, this is famous also in the Bible, older people, more ancient people lived longer, much longer, right? This is told in so many different myths, in many other religions. And we see that we're weaker, we're more fragile, generation after generation. This is also quite biologically evident, because that the generation is at play, and this is completely coherent also with other Indo-European views of the world, including the scanning of the various ages, the fourth age, saying just in Norse Germanic beliefs, with eventually the twilight of the gods and so on. So there is no doubt that this is the fundamental theme, and that there is no division or separation between the idea that you can be a hero, and when you fail, you pay for it. It's incredibly idiotic to presume this is just a Semitic thing. This is present literally in every single religion that we are aware of. It may be more pronounced there. There's no doubt that if you obviously are aware of the Bible, that this is told in much more sort of burdensome terms. No doubt about that whatsoever either. But it's not like the other myths do not tell that. They're all pretty eloquent about it. It's the whole theme. It's the whole reason why these things literally degenerated into mortality and to an accomplishment, right? And heroic failure as well. I mean, Heracles is not Achilles as well. That speaks of a stratification of metaphysical takes. Something more primordial, celestial, as opposed to something more human and earthly bound, right? A bit like Gilgamesh as well. In every culture, indeed, has its own degree of this, right? And in this sense, it is also wrong to presume that Adam is no longer one who fell in adventure where others succeeded. Is instead one who sinned, and what happened to him is the only thing that could have happened. Because even in a Nietzschean perspective, or in a providential perspective, understood also in non-Christian terms, for example, in the providenti of the Romans or any other. There are different terms for this. Think about wisdom also in the Germanic root. The fact that something happens is not, okay, well, now roll the dice once again until I win. That literally has a metaphysical impact. Your failure, your sin has a metaphysical impact. Things go wrong because of that. That's how the entirety of myths fundamentally explain also how the world came to be about. Mostly through suffering, errors, pain, disasters, right? This is told in the Bible as much as it's told in Hellenic mythology, and so on and so on. There are all very bloody, brutal clashes in essentially a real order that is not something that actually also grieves the gods. And these are, especially in the latter myths of later stages, especially of historical, prehistorical understanding of these myths. The Hellenic ones, for example, are more modern, secular, and in this sense, much more anthropomorphic, much more sensualistic, but much more Pelagian influenced. It's through the heroic victory that true Apollonian order is restored. And this intersects, as we've seen, especially with Roman histories, with actual history that witnessed in the Augustan era the Reformation of the Golden Age, for a brief parenthesis between the Bronze and the Iron Age, that Christians, you can't say used because Christ was meant to have exactly lived at that point, marks exactly this watershed, what Christianity comes about to fix, as we were saying before, in this Western way, so to say, or just the sort of Western Eurasian way, if you prefer, that path, right? And so what actually the Bible shows is that it's not much that Adam had no recourse but to make amends by expiating, and above all by renouncing the will to draw into to that enterprise, right? That he just live with that. It's sort of quite descriptive of human condition and the utter dismay at the pain, the suffering that entails, and with a story that begins after Adam in a relation with God that is like, training a muscle. If you look at the history of Israel, that's fundamentally this ups and downs, connected also to this collective enterprise where there are failures and triumphs, and there's this constant regulation based on the idea that fundamentally there is also a new covenant that must be reaffirmed at the point if sort of the people is not enough to rise once again toward more divine standards. And so there's a messianic understanding there of a restorer or of the kingdom of David. So again, there is all a story that we will see at some point, some Jewish history video that we don't really make often, but it's crucial in the idea. There is in the Bible the idea that the defeat might contemplate revenge or hold fast to the dignity, to the dignity his act secured him would appear from the religious viewpoint as the most reprehensible Luciferianism. And indeed, who is there Lucifer? The guy who could actually substitute God, but it fell the lowest exactly because he was capable of doing that. That is also quite much what happens in the Olympian struggle, for example. These titans that are enormous, prodigious, but also fall the lowest exactly because they are, not because they are in the sense inferior, but exactly because they are big and the giants, it's all mythology is present with that. And that obviously speaks of somebody who had the potential, if anything, of winning the palm of immortality, but failed to do that and transformed, therefore, in something that grieves in a much deeper sense. And this is incredibly true in the sense that if we see this also as a metaphor for the fall of man, is incredibly relatable. Like no pain is greater as the one of of somebody who fails, reaching the highest level, being just one step away from complete victory and then losing everything in the process. That really puts things into massive perspective. And that's why you must have that antagonist, fundamentally, to set also the standard of how far and how much you can go. So imagine, in this sense, Satan being seen as the force that you have to tame yourself as God yourself. And that, in this sense, you must get to know in order to be able to grow antibodies against. That's the same reason why Christ goes to hell after he is crucified. Right? And it could have not happened had he descended into the depths of the abyss. And this is all at the basis of initiatic, so the initiatic phase of tradition, in all tradition. The path of the left hand, where the fire of death blazes. And that's why it's the scariest and the most difficult, but it doesn't mean that it's not there. Indeed, that is an exemplum to be shown, to see how much of an effort it takes to restore a positive path for divinity, toward divinity, right? If the later world sort of modernized and secularized, degenerated essentially to the point of seeing, look, just whatever Satan did, whatever Lucifer did, you must never do. And you just have to sit there like a potato. Like that's not actually the meaning of Christianity. It was not even meant to be the meaning of, I don't know, of the Old Testament to begin with. And I think it's incredibly important to reflect, because that fall happens in the other heroic cycles as well. And the story, in many ways, is in fact all about that. Wu does actually make it once again. Wu does bring the struggle at the next level, at the highest level. Right? You have some very singular paradigms. You don't have multiple elements. You have basically the same son that becomes the father again in order to succeed. And this is, in fact, exactly the philosophical incest that alchemy talks about, because there's this divine replenishment but also substitution at the top that seizes the queen of the forest. That is the world, nature itself. That, for example, in the Bible, God entrusts to man. That's yet another interesting aspect of the world, that there is a subcontracting of creation that God bestows onto man. So there is definitely a level of agency and responsibility also in that very Veterotestamentary tradition, right? There is, however, an interesting parallelism that can be drawn, especially as far as our quest for the sort of archetypal understanding of the clash between Welfs and Ghibellines, and or at least this competition, but also coordination, cooperation that the papas in the empire had, for example, in the Middle Ages. So after the great classical tradition had split, at least in the West, the difference between the warrior and the priest for better functionalization, given that mankind as a whole had failed at detaining single powers standing, and when still doing so at their expenses, like in Islam, that does not have a priesthood. It turned out to be much more degraded and fragmented than Christianity. Now, the idea, the obvious parallelism is that this idea of the judgment would have been not emphasized because, of course, the scriptures are what they are, but of course, there would be a priestly element to this judgment of the hero that must carry out penitence, that must atone for his sins, and so on. That would, in that sense, show a priestly estate that would have at some point been opposed to a regal one. And that would thus always be inquiring the validity of the hero, right? Interestingly enough, in sacred royalty, the priestly function is, of course, contained by the hero, by the king, right? So if one sees this in archetypal terms, the necessity of a priesthood is true for every system, right? There must be an element of of the system tasked with the, if you want, more contemplative realization or observation of the hero's deeds. And so the capacity of discipline him toward a more effective obtainment of divinity. This is technically what the papacy was supposed to support the emperor, where the church had to back the emperor to guide, in fact, the ecumenate towards completion, right? And the idea being, in fact, for example, that is present in the Byzantine world, but it was also present in the Western world in the Middle Ages, that as Frederick II of Hohenstaufen would style himself Sol Invictus, and this is something quite recurring also in early medieval iconography. I came across the other day a beautiful sarcophagus from early medieval Spain, Visigothic times, pre-Islamic conquest, that literally showed Christ as Sol Invictus, literally written on it. And so, in a fully Christian reality, this was not by the time of still the Arians. It had, in any case, nothing to do with that. On the contrary, because normally the Arians saw in Christ not really much of a divine figure, but more of an earthly one. Remember that, because that Gnostic attempt, like this, greatly reminds counterculture, like fringe cultures that have to compete with a big universal that is Catholic one, start saying, no, you can't actually win. That's how Protestants did, like in the Renaissance, right? And it's this creeping attitude. Well, that's one of defeatism, as a matter of fact. But the priestly one was to properly and obviously check. This is very many, quote-unquote, self-styled, by the way, Ghibellines believe that eliminate the priesthood. The priesthood is bad. It hasn't to be bad. If you even have a brief and cursory idea of, say, I don't know, any Indo-European theology, you do know that priestly element must always be present, and yes, battled and tamed and absorbed as a priestly function for the king itself, if there is such opposition. As a matter of fact, we're about the symbol of the boar in pretty much all across all the Indo-European. You find it among the Alains, among the Celts, and the Italics, the Germans. It's present all over the West, right? This doesn't mean it doesn't have to be, or that has to be eliminated, but it must be integrated, must be subsumed. Right? In the fact that an emperor does not manage to sort of subjugate the clergy, that at some point was institutionally subjugated to the emperor in fully Catholic Christian times. Look at, I don't know, the relation between the papacy and Louis the Pious, for example. It was almost a basilatic, in that sense, relation, right? But the emperor was at the top and the papacy was below, right? Is actually beneficial to exactly that level of positive competition that has to spur the emperor to actually achieve divinity in a time, by the way, after the Roman Empire, in fact, in which the idea was that people had failed to save the world and themselves, even through Christ. Because if an emperor had been existed, could control the world, like at the time of Augustus, there would have been truly a new divinization. Naturally, in Christian terms, only Christ divinized, right? But there are arguments to be made, again, going back in time, right? Who is also able to come closer to God, and so in what kind of historical, say, in order of importance, historical figures should be seen. Such as the aforementioned people who lived hundreds and hundreds of years, for example. Those were meant to be more divine in character. All right. And so the clergy can't be seen as responsible for this. If anything, the clergy, and especially if you look at today's world, is, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, actually the only element of the older Catholic order that at least still manifests certain forms of the traditional clergy that we don't see a correspective of, for example, in lay authority. Yes, I don't know, the President of the United States as a whole, whoever holds their imperium, is the largest power in the world, but in which relation does it pose itself with the great Catholic tradition? its power manifest, it's divinely given. There is no power that is not given by God, including the one to Lucifer to rise close to God, because God is the only source of that power that rewards where indeed the works are worth of divine grace. But in this sense, regardless of what happened in some countries, like in Britain, where the church became a joke, and at this point it's sort of weird. Other people take care of churches, but they ask people who can pray there. But you actually believe in this? Like it's literally. This is the only place that I'm aware of where this is happening, at least in Europe. I know that, of course, like I don't know, in post-socialist Europe, like people sometimes don't even know what Christianity is or whatever. Like this is, if you talk to people in general, that's the case. But coming from a country that has a pretty high church attendance in Europe, and it's still like obviously a modern secular country. In many ways, I understand, of course, how the generation operated. But it makes me really think of this contrast. People do not even know what these functions, the warrior, the priest, really are about, in which kind of formal hierarchy they should be properly established, right? So obviously, think about those videos we made on medieval penitentiaries. They're one of the most interesting type of sources of medieval times. It's necessary as mortals to atone from our sins, because as long as we're mortals, we constantly sin. So there is nothing. This is not about, okay, so as Gnostics say, let's die, basically, because we decide they fantasize that there is a God that saves them without doing nothing but die, right? Which is, in that sense, maybe understood as self-sacrificial, but in not a heroic sense, literally in a completely accelerated degenerative sense that actually has nothing to do with winning death. It has to do just with letting yourself go, which is a dreadfully Pelagian, materialistic, communistic, feministic attitude. It's a completely anti-imperial Catholic traditional. Yet in this sense, the church should watch over your actual atonement. And this is very interesting because in Christian tradition, the church is transfigured, right? The entire symbol of the church, the head of the church is not a woman. The head of the church is a man, right? It's Christ. That is, in fact, king, as also the husband of the church. And the entire feminine symbolism of the church is the one of a transfigured feminine, as we see also, for example, in Artemis, Diana, that is also, in fact, transposed as Virgin Mary in Christianity. That is yet another theme, like the idea that also the virgin birth, you would think that's a problem of translation, but it's present in all these other traditions because the fully restored female principle as well. And one that defeats its tonic element thanks to the victory of her men and king of the four. So the church has to watch over the warrior to give him that discipline that can make him achieve divinity as well. And it's not a trivial matter, because Ghibellines would say, like, okay, there was this, I say modern Ghibellines, so to say, if there is such a thing, there was this tradition that the church tried to quote-unquote hide. This is also not quite the case, right? The church was aware of that. It was fully okay with it. And the reason why it was sort of, in some cases, demonized, think about how, I don't know, even Vodanic tradition was to some extent associated to, in fact, hellish, inferical elements. This is exactly the same concept of Lucifer. Did that guy make it into divinity? No. So it's not like the chthonic dimension there is merely a condemnation. The church never thought that there had to be just an Apollonian on earth, because this is theologically impossible. It's earth. There must be a chthonic dimension that must be transfigured. But which one does actually succeed, right? If the warrior does not manage to take over the world and tame the church, he's failing by definition, because he's not God and he doesn't control everything. And so whose fault is that? His, not the church's. The church is the church in this, so the at least the feminine archetype that is said to be, again, having been transfigured in the Christian case, but by Christ, in eternal, that still has this earthly function where indeed priests and warriors are also people, right? And so fallen mortals, is the one that in all mythology you must possess, tame, and rule, and in a positive sense. All what you see in modernism, secularism, is the rejection of that clerical dimension, as if that was an anomaly. If you think that you are the anomaly, that actually means that you're failing and you're basically lashing out at everything because you're just an immature, fatherless mortal who's incapable of divinizing. Which is exactly what actually Protestantism did by abandoning the church. And also failing, as we're seeing. Like all those cultures are the ones who most brutally accelerated toward atheism. And not only, right? And definitely not establishing an ecumenic unit or universal world, but actually insisting on a fractally, at the end of the day, unsuccessful one. A bit of power as being, freed by the constraints imposed by the church, but failure outside of it, unavoidably so, right? So we can reflect on all of this, especially through the Hermetic tradition, through alchemy that we've seen many times. In fact, we all know that all heroic cycles are directly tied to ancient mythologies, illustrating through deep allegory a cosmic scenario defined by inherent jeopardy and deep ambiguity. It could have not been otherwise. Immortality, divinity was at stake there. One exegesis gives us the rod of Hermes as the symbol of the union of a son, Zeus, with his mother Rhea, symbol of universal force. We discussed this just last week, whom he pursued and bound after, quote-unquote, killing the father and assuming the kingdom. So it's that aforementioned substitution at the top, as literally Christ becomes God, and he truly achieves divinity. It's not like he is simply God as such, because here, again, I don't want to descend into the point of the divine and human nature and how they interplay, and people clashed quite a bit over the centuries over this stuff, but it's unequivocal from the Gospels that Christ grows, learns, right? So there is an actual achievement. Christ is not resurrected because he's vindicated by God. That would be actually a Judaic reading of the wall. Christ wins divinity by himself, right? He obviously resurrects to divine grace, but because he nailed it. Okay, it sounds bad talking about nails with Christ, but say in that sense, he actually succeeded in obtaining the necessary grace to transcend mortal nature. And he truly does that by his own works, right? It was providentially established, but because he could do that, right, according to Christian doctrine. So this is also clear that Christ is father, husband, and son of the absolute maternal archetype as well. This is true. Look at the church and Mary and so on. So the symbol of philosophical incest, right? We shall find it throughout Hermetic literature. It's really obvious. Hermes is the messenger of the gods, but also the one. So he's the Holy Ghost, the Imperium Danica, right? He's one who managed to steal the scepter from Zeus, the girdle from Venus, Aphrodite, the allegorical tools of his art from Vulcan, Hephaestus, god of the fire of the earth in the Egyptian tradition. And you realize that this is a Trinitarian reference, right, to the two natures, the divine one, that is Zeus, the Apollonian, virile one, the chthonic one, so that would represent the sun as essentially still untranscended, so still earthly, Venusian, so the realm of the Mother Earth. And that application that in here is symbolized by by Mercury in that sense that is also, as you know, quite much involved in various kind of activities and exchanges and so on. Here connected also in some myths with Hephaestus. So a bit like a Promethean figure himself. And so the one of the hero, the one of sacred royalty that battles in this dimension suspended between God and man, that is distant from both, and that therefore has a plenitude of its own. And in the Egyptian tradition, as reported by later authors, such as those preserving the Hermetic corpus, Mercury, Trismegistus, vested in fact with triple greatness, merges with the figure of one of the primordial kings and masters who would have given men the principles of a superior civilization. We've seen it well also in the video about Taoism and the Chinese tradition. There is this idea, such as auspicia patrum sunt, from a Latin standpoint, that there were this older kind that actually knew how to pass to the other side, right? Meant as not the afterlife per se, but winning over second death and achieving heaven. They knew, right? These were the kings. Remember when Pyrrhus sends his ambassador to the Roman Senate, and he comes back saying, this is not a normal council, this is a group of kings. As a matter of fact, that's how vivid, still by the 3rd century BC, among the Hellenists and the Italics even more evidently here, the concept that rule is of divine derivation, at least. Right, and that there is a divine element that lives in the greater the earthly power is. This syncretic Hermes Trismegistus, combining the Hellenic Hermes with the Egyptian thought, the ibis-headed scribe of the gods and inventor of writing. We will talk about this. We partially address also ancient Egyptian religion. There is really a lot to say about that. Became, in any case, the legendary source of profound philosophical, astrological, and theurgical wisdom in texts like, in fact, the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of Hellenic treatises composed between approximately the 1st and the 3rd centuries AD in Roman Egypt and presented as divine revelations from Hermes to his disciples, influencing Renaissance thinkers who viewed these writings as preserving ancient Egyptian and primordial revelations on cosmology, quote-unquote magic, and the ascent of the soul through gnosis, not meant in a gnostic sense necessarily, toward the divine union. So again, these were places where Gnosticism also existed, and indeed that gnoseologistic temptation of thinking this is just like the body doctrine that if you reveal, you will simply go to heaven. That's a mistake, right? That appeared in Christianity, outside of Christianity. It's completely normal, especially in a great, more sort of effete, stagnating civilization like the later Hellenistic one that was mostly overtly conceptualizing, right? In places where the majority of people didn't actually read anything, right? Very few court scholars entered these massive warehouses of manuscripts like the Alexandria's library, where actually people in Rome actually went to the library reading individually, or at least collectively it was somebody who read to them, but say they actually went there for learning. So understand the differences, right? Understand the differences in moral, cultural, ethnic temper. These are incredibly deep and relevant in a historical sense. And this stuff reemerged, especially towards the age of humanism, the Renaissance. There were translations from Greek by Marsilio Ficino in 1463. We're talking about the Tuscan, the Medicean world, some of the peak of philological revival. In fact, sparking a broader studying that shaped humanists like the same Pico della Mirandola and Giordano Bruno in their pursuit of the Prisca Theologia, the ancient theology underlying all true wisdom, even though some of these were actually captured by the, if not the Gnostic temptation, at least this idea that fundamentally there was more to know. These were modern people that were re-exposed to these ancient scripts, not quite in the same way maybe even a warrior could have done still in the 15th century. And they, or later, for that matter, Giordano Bruno is from later, but I mean, truly in a time in which the modern secular, the generation was so advanced that it's truly the moment, as we said before, when people stopped understanding what this traditional body really was. Like, if in the early modern age you presented these texts from ancient Roman Egypt, claiming that this could, if not substitute the Bible, but at least constitute something additional to it or complementing it, like, obviously the church was in the historical place of saying this is BS, aside from Bruno's issue that was much sort of more complicated in a general sense, because it's also the limit of this modern people that in any case were failing. But say the church of 1000 AD would have been much more aware, right, of the meaning of these texts, and partially seeing what was correct about them and what was also wrong in some cases, than the church of 1600, right? You have to blame it not on the church, but on the level of collective ignorance and unawareness that the world had fallen into entirely, universally, in any part. Actually, Europeans had been pioneering this stuff for a very long time, together with this broader Mediterranean Hellenistic legacy, right? This second, third century AD Hellenic treatises, such as the Poimandres, which describes a visionary cosmogony and anthropogony, emphasizing the divine origin of the human mind in particular. And so here we're going towards a more Gnostic bias. Its potential return to the source presented as revelations from Hermes Trismegistus, emphasizing, again, Gnosis in particular as salvific knowledge. So this is, again, a specific reinterpretation of older and primordial tradition, right? But what matters here is the fact that this text suggests that, in any case, this body doctrine would enable the soul's ascent through the planetary spheres back to the divine source, profoundly impacting Florentine Platonism and later esoteric currents by bridging pre-Christian wisdom with emerging Christian and humanist thought, right? Naturally, when we look at Plato and Aristotle, we're looking at, primordially speaking, pretty recent authors. So they had their own biases. I mention it because these were fundamentally Neoplatonic thoughts, right? At that point in the 15th century, they didn't even know that Plotinus was not Plato, philologically, yet, right? So this is quite fascinating, but of course, it was a fascination for the realm of ideas, of conceptualization, which is typically modern. It's exactly what was happening in the Renaissance, but exactly how it was happening in that stagnating Hellenistic world where the Romans instead had sort of taken everything over. And you see, this is not something that, I don't know, an Italic would have written. This is stuff you find, again, in Hellenistic Egypt, and there is a reason for that. We can't grasp, as we have already done, even through Christian apologetic texts that look at Gnostic stuff and debunk them. However, how much of that was still a footprint of older beliefs that help understanding that sense, the same Christianity or the same other religions. There is yet another concept, namely that the quote-unquote foundational energy would be essentially female. It's a bit poorly phrased, but let's say the idea is that the tree equals the sovereign feminine, if you think about it. That's Mother Earth. That's the tree that is fundamentally tied to the lower dimension, right? So when you say that foundational energy is feminine, it's not because this does not derive from God. Naturally, we're talking about a primordially archetypal dimension where, say, creation-wise, you would have to look at what was originating before and so on. This is not what we're doing today, but the idea is also that, in a timeless sense, the divine is born out of the darkest of the abyss, which is obviously the womb, right? At the same time, this tree of life is exactly the medium toward that, like toward heaven, but also in the bowels of the earth. And he who seizes the tree of life rules and allows the same tree of life to blossom, to constantly regenerate, right? You have to fecundate the feminine in order to regenerate. And this happens through victory, to a conquest, right? And that's also why the tree of life, as we've seen also in the myth of the medieval emperors, remains permanently vulnerable to the specific aggression that, for example, the Gospels declare may be directed toward the quote-unquote kingdom of heaven, right? There is always that risk of sinning, again, of conceiving your own mortality and dying as a consequence. And so it has to be a full victory. In among those making the daring attempt, certain individuals successfully break through and achieve this dominion, whereas others collapse and suffer for their boldness, bearing the destructive consequences of that identical current, as we were describing before. For example, a parallel account documented by Tertullian, the early North African church father writing around 200 AD, whose works bridge classical philosophy and Christian doctrine with rigorous moral treatises, such as On the Apparel of Women, for example, and Apology, that are not, therefore, quite random, which echoes throughout Arab Syriac alchemical hermeticism as well, interestingly enough, points toward an identical conclusion by asserting that natural creations deemed, quote, unquote, cursed and useless, metallurgical mysteries, herbal properties, magical incantations, and, quote, those strange doctrines which go as far as the science of the stars, representing the entire body of ancient magical hermetic knowledge, were communicated to humanity by rebellious cosmic beings. This is incredibly deep because Tertullian is here warning against the aforementioned Gnostic and, say, technologistic trick, right? It's like saying alchemy talks about actual sort of elements of the periodic table relation. It's not like it's untrue, but it would fixate just a materialistic interpretation of that. The ars regia refers to an allegorical dimension that, of course, can be read through the natural world, but is primarily metaphysical, right? And so the idea here that Tertullian is criticizing is that fixating exclusively with this and ending up essentially under a superstition that things are going to work for you just if you use them correctly without understanding what's beyond and training yourself pretty hard and trying to use them as a shortcut, not to sacrifice yourself in holy combat. You're not going to go anywhere. Tertullian, naturally most famously influential in Latin theology, is one of the first major Christian writers in Latin, among the other things, explicitly links these aforementioned teachings, subjects, say, to the Watcher's corruption, while acknowledging their role in civilizational arts, such as astrology and metalworking, that, however, fueled idolatry and vanity. So that they were a double-edged sword, right? Truly Luciferian in that sense, because they were an end to themselves, right? So it's not like you can't obtain great things, right? It's like the ones that the world could obtain today through technology. There is an enormous merit in this, and no such power can be wielded without divine support, but the lack of form that is metaphysical eventually brings about distraction of same mankind. Just like for Prometheus, of course, there is an active efficacy of these means, but they also bring about that distraction. And so they actually, yes, are able to bring about greater achievements, but they're still nothing compared to the spiritual dimension that even through these tools can be properly achieved, right? It's as if you were starting to reach God not through a direct action of pure will, but putting patches on your own mistakes. It's a way, and that's what civilization does, basically. But in this sense, it's not entirely the thing. In fact, that's the entire part of the Gospels that doesn't deny, and actually does acknowledge and does care about the world because people are in it, but says, if you want to truly achieve the kingdom of heaven, you must realize how limited that is, what pertains to the lower nature and what pertains to the higher nature. If you're not aware of the doctrine of the two natures, you can't quite do much in that sense, right? So think how easily these teachings can become superstitious. Like every chthonic peasant community knew about herbs and would attribute effect to women / the witches that would have this heroic powers. No, they were superstitious, looking at things and predicting in a truly chthonic feministic sense what would happen to people, as opposed to do anything about that. The powers of enchantments, the interpretation of the stars as something that happens to you as opposed to something that reflects you. And so, of course, in the ancient world, there was a spectrum of how people related to these things more or less correctly. But it's kind of obvious, as we were saying before, that already by that point in history, people had lost that capacity of saving themselves, even just aspirationally speaking. And that's actually a major issue, because that's also where we are today. Besides, very interesting food for thought comes from the book of Enoch, that we will at some point discuss more thoroughly. And read, especially in the context of this more ancient tradition, concerning the Ben Elohim, so those fallen entities who descended to Mount Hermon. And no, Hermon has nothing to do with Hermes, by the way, it's just a coincidence. It comes from the Semitic root Hermon, that means sanctity, consecration, or taboo, right? So, again, it's a bit connected with the same Haram, for giving you an idea of this inaccessible place, right? So Hermon, Haram, and this tells you also, for example, how in Islam, that term is used also in memes to show something that it's fundamentally forbidden at that point. And that's not quite the case according to this even earlier Semitic tradition. So that shows you how changing over time this stuff was. A prominent peak in the anti-Lebanon mountain range straddling modern Syria and Lebanon. Revered in antiquity, in fact, for its height reaching over 9,000 feet, its snow-capped summit visible for miles, and associations with sacred oaths, divine encounters, and as a cosmic mountain linking heaven and earth, a sort of Levantine Olympus. As referenced, in fact, in the book of Enoch, specifically the book of Watchers section, that's what Watchers we mentioned before, the detailed account of the 200 Watchers swearing their pact under Semjaza on the summit, binding themselves by mutual imprecations not to abandon the plan. Right? This is a base of sacred war bands, of titanic force that wants to elevate itself collectively toward the divinity. These Watchers, 200 in number, descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon, and they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn to and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it with leaders including Samlazadz, Semjaza, Araklba, Ramel, Kokabel, Tamlel, Ramlel, Danel, and Azazel among them. They took human wives from among the daughters of men, taught charms, enchantments, the cutting of roots, knowledge of plants and herbs, and produced great giants, the Nephilim, who consumed the acquisitions of men, turned to violence and cannibalism against humanity itself, with Azazel notably instructing in the making of swords, knives, shields, breastplates, the working of metals, bracelets, ornaments, antimony for eye paint, and other corrupting arts that parallel Prometheus' civilizing gifts and contributed to the widespread corruption prompting the divine judgment of the flood. The Nephilim, offspring of these unions between the sons of God and daughters of man, humans if you prefer, are depicted as violent giants of hybrid nature, whose depredations and consumption of resources contributed to the corruption prompting the flood, embodying hybrid vigor. It's essentially a degeneration. So the flood also has the return of a waterly principle to destroy order, right, divine form, but embodying hybrid vigor and the dangerous infusion of otherworldly knowledge into human affairs in a disorderly fashion, in a differentiated fashion. These are different people, at the end of the day, different powers, right, with their own, in fact, with not a unique head, right? Among the Ben Elohim, the fallen angels descended upon Mount Hermon, of which in Enoch is that stock of the awoken and the watchers we said before, Gregoroi, who descended to instruct humanity, right? In the same way that Prometheus taught mortals all the arts, so to say, of which in the Book of Jubilees, which retells Genesis and Exodus with chronological and alachic expansions, we were recounting that before, there exists a visible correspondence. There is more. In Enoch, Azazel, quote, who seduced Eve, in some interpretative layers, would have taught men the use of weapons that kill. Outside the metaphor, he would have infused in them the warrior spirit. The narrative concerning this cosmic descent is well established. These celestial beings were overcome by a longing for women, right? So they were distracted by the lower chthonic dimension that they contributed to spread further in the world, right? And so they were biased, as we explained before, toward this lower mechanisms that they had sort of tried to instill in order to sort of model like divine mode, so to say. And yet, as previously demonstrated, the symbolic role of woman in alignment with the tree is clear. The etymology of Nephilim that stands for the fallen ones, literally, and those who cause others to fall, probably, even though the etymology is debated, I think show what kind of creatures they are, right? They're kind of seducing and being seduced themselves through false modes to spiritual reenactment, right? And they're creating more disorder than they're actually wishing. Right? They think actually they're doing something great, but they're actually ending up to be seduced themselves with their own same means, and they're practically incapable of controlling, right? And in this sense, they are seduced by women exactly because they are weak. They don't dominate them. They're seduced by them. And you find, in fact, the aforementioned Semitic bias towards the hero who tries to control and seduce the woman, also the one of the tree standing across the waters, and so the earthly paradise, like in Gilgamesh's epos, and that, however, do not cope with them, that are not able to accomplish the mission, to win, right? And the woman at some point actually limits them and creates problems to them. And so, as previously exposed, the symbolic role of the woman, the feminine archetype in alignment with the tree of life, is clear. Besides, there are parallelisms in Indo-European tradition, plenty of course. This framework is reinforced, for example, by the Sanskrit concept Shakti, applied in a metaphysical sense to denote the female counterpart or consort of a deity, while simultaneously representing his active potency and dynamic power. Consequently, these celestial beings, the Watchers, were driven by an underlying longing for sovereign power, but they were corrupted by it, or at least they were incapable of actually attaining it. Because there isn't such a thing like being corrupted by power. If anything, you're corrupt and you can't wield power. Remember that when you read Tolkien, that is, it was meant to be Catholic, but was overwhelmingly Protestantly influence, especially the concept of providence. But following their union with sovereign power, and so the woman that is understood as a queen here, they experience a literal descent, moving downward to a high terrestrial point, the Mount Hermon. That's how the fall had occurred as well. So that's where they tried also to bring things back in order, but they couldn't. This profound, and they actually created a vogue across Earth. I would like to stress that the etymology of the Watchers is also an inversion, in fact, of the providential meaning that providence is the eye that generates, that creates himself. So it's not literally seeing, it's not beholding. That is a typically Venusian exercise, right? It's like people watched in the eyes of Medusa were petrified, so they fell again. So this is the same myth. It's the idea that these are the beholders also, like they're meant to be the watchers, so to actually watch themselves and from not doing something. But there is a myth also in the Odyssey with Ulysses and the sirens, but they're ending up to see and to want, and so to become as opposed to be. All right, and so they degenerate. All right, this profound interaction generated the Nephilim. That this was a dominant lineage allegorically categorized as giants, yet their non-mortal essence is clarified by the Book of Enoch as hybrid beings whose actions awakened heroic and martial drives in humanity at the same time, because they, after all, the Watchers infused some sort of higher divine element into this, and through means that were more, as you've seen, civilizational, through that aforementioned patchworking kind of, let's use this or that tool, but without necessarily understanding the correct order, derives primarily through a spiritual, proceeds primarily through a spiritual path. The Nephilim, the fallen angels, are thus none other than the Titans and those who watch as well. They are themselves, like their fathers, they are the stock called glorious and warlike in an earthly sense, because the earthly sense is lower than them. These guys are still bigger. They're the giants. This is said, for example, in the book of Baruch 3:26, one and the same race that ignited in men the spirit of heroes and warriors, shaped their arts and transmitted the mystery of magic. Remember that in this sense, the Nephilims are not fundamentally some Bronze Age leaders, right? They belong to this primordial, pre-Diluvian, antediluvian phase that is mythical, but they are attributed, like Prometheus, in this older time of myth, that procession of technology. In the oldest traditions, which Hesiod also relates, these quote-unquote sentinels merged completely with the entities of the primordial golden age, who escaped death and merely became imperceptible to human beings in later epochs as the ages declined into silver, bronze, and iron. The last aspect is particularly useful to understand, in fact, how ages, as we understand, are not merely a chronological order, but different metaphysical conditions, and this helps better understanding the doctrine of two natures, right? Humans didn't lose the Nephilim. Humans lost the ability to perceive the heroic and magical reality that the Nephilim inhabited. As we transition into the Iron Age, our focus shifted entirely to the material world, rendering these sentinels invisible to us, right? So while the entities themselves became hidden, or say we couldn't see them better, this is the case also for the higher nature, their influence did remain, and they left behind, in fact, also in the Hermetic tradition, is so-called arts, magic, and the heroic martial drive that shape human civilization. So while we can no longer see the Titans, so to say, we are living in the civilizations they helped forge, right? This is incredibly fascinating. Turning to the direct exploration of the alchemical hermetic stream, no validation is more compelling than the direct alignment of these writings with that exact lineage, as a particular hermetic manuscript notes the passage on angels and chemical arts originating from them, in fact, linking chemi, literally, to the Egyptian term for the black fertile soil, the Nile, foundational to the etymology of alchemy as the black art, at least with this initial mortifying passage that allows you to transcend, really. Or, in fact, transformative science emerging from ancient Chem, the name for Egypt itself. Now, for the investigation to the spirit of the Hermetic alchemic tradition, what proof could be more interesting and sound than the explicit recourse of the text to precisely that tradition? One reads in a Hermetic text that certain angels were taken by passion for women. As we explained, they descended to earth and taught them all the operations of nature. It is they who compose the works, and from them comes the first tradition of this art. The root term chemi surfaces originally with texts tied to this lineage, paralleling the syncretic development of Hermeticism rooted in the fusion of Greek Hermes and Egyptian thought as Hermes Trismegistus. A matching narrative is found even in the Quran 296, which outlines how the twin entities Harut and Marut became infatuated with woman, and after descending, taught magical arts to humans while suspended upside down within a cavern. Right? This showing also a bit that sort of self-sacrificial dimension, and within the abyss that was required to descend it in order to gain. This matches indeed the symbolism of the cosmic Vedic tree, for example, which stands inverted owing to its roots being situated on high in the divine realm, while its branches extended downward into manifestation. This is a very interesting way of seeing it. Essentially, you have, just like the Nephilim, as we've seen, the branches of their doing manifesting in this world, but the roots being in heaven, being beyond, right? Incredibly fascinating, especially considering that how strong this parallelism is across these cultures. The underlying implication of these narratives is entirely clear, extending this theme further to demonstrate that the spark of God is never extinguished, right? As long as anything happens, this is continuing forward, refined through, or even declining indeed, but refined through the hidden transmission of the royal art, right? You've seen here the sages in the cavern, they're also upside down because they do really come from heaven, so but also from a path that is inverted to what the one of humans really try, at least to strive to go opposite, because going down, being oriented toward the down, is definitely the main direction of becoming in the world. And so there is this search, let's say, this great attempt to fashion an alternative tree of life to replace the original loss, even in this world, as the same watchers tried. The flame does not extinguish. It transmits and purifies itself in the secret tradition of the royal art, which in certain Hermetic texts explicitly identifies with the construction of a second wood of life, so to say, in replacement to the lost one. It aims at that access to the center of the tree, which is in the midst of the earthly paradise, which implies an atrocious combat against opposing forces. It is, in short, a resumption of the ancient audacity, according to the spirit of Olympian Heracles, the subduer of Titans, in fact, who unbound Prometheus after completing his labors, and so redeems even the Watchers, as you understand, because he's superior to them, of Mithra, as well, master of the solar force in Persian mysteries involving the Tauroctony bull slaying and ascent through 7 gates, that are the same ones of alchemy, for that matter. And as you know, in numerology, 7 has something to say. We'll see it better in another video. And generally matching, in fact, the archetype designated in, for example, the Buddhist Asian traditions as the, quote, Lord of Man and of Gods, right? The Chakravartin, or World Sovereign, who turns the wheel of Dharma. And so that actually sees and controls, directs everything, right? And if you look at alchemy, there are sort of lots of different works also that in modern age reflect this. For example, Cesare della Riviera, that we already encounter in the Magic World of Heroes, Mondo Magico degli Eroi, published in 1605. This was an Italian alchemist, records how, illuminated by rays of uncreated wisdom, he mystically beheld a marvelous image and real likeness of that same vital wood, which we rightly call the mystic or second tree of life because of the affinity and sympathy between them. This is the heavenly maiden, right? She's the queen of the forest. And that place can be called the second earthly paradise. And the most clement Lord de la Riviera says, granted men this free and ample gift, together with the faculty to operate in imitation of him, wonders worthy of eternal marvel in this inferior world. This subject of human wisdom immediately proceeding from the divine is the vessel, matrix, and foundation of all elements, receptacle of all celestial rays and influences, containing the seeds and seminal virtues of all things, perpetually fecundated by elements and heavens, producer of all things in the lower world, prima materia of our creation, the alchemist says. This is very interesting because it also shows how the heavenly maiden is truly the transfigured soul of the hero. She's the Nike. She's Victoria herself, right? So she definitely does connect in a Trinitarian sense the two natures, right? Everything that exists in this world, and so the lower and transfigured Mother Earth only derives from this higher principle, right? She can't exist only because this higher feminine principle is being held and dominated by God, and in this sense, it's contained by that. At least when possessed by God, it is really capable of transfiguring the world in the heavenly maiden. De La Riviere says, supreme medicine of human bodies, center, foundation, and source of all corporeal and sensible creatures, aligning with the alchemical pursuit of the philosopher's stone as a restored axis of vitality capable of transmuting base metals and perfecting the human form. We find also further evidence in Basil Valentine that we already met in the alchemic tradition. Inside the adset of St. Trismegistus, inside the aureum velos clarify the specific methodology of the royal art with greater specificity. Right. So these texts elaborate operational techniques as well by this point for the great work, emphasizing the unification of opposites, sulfur and mercury, sun and moon, fixed and volatile. We already discussed this in part, as well as the fine production of the philosopher's stone and the perfected embodiment of the living tree through symbolic processes illustrated in emblematic series depicting stages of dissolution in mercurial waters, purification by fire, and conjunction into the rebis or androgen, that is basically the hierarchical body of the male dominating the feminine. In fact, Basil Valentine's Adset of the Philosopher, this was a 17th century compilation attributed to the semi-legendary 15th century Benedictine monk and alchemist whose works profoundly shaped later European alchemical symbolism and laboratory practice. It was meant to be a French, and that also cooperated with his wife. There's an archetype behind that. We will read more of Basil Valentine's work. But the point of modern alchemy, obviously, presenting a comprehensive emblematic guide to metallic transmutation and spiritual perfection through this famous illustrations, mandala, or series of images outlining the stages of the magnum opus from prima materia through calcination, dissolution, separation, the 7R, conjunction, fermentation, distillation, coagulation to ultimate unity. So it's primarily dissolve and reform, right? That's the power of the form, spiritual form over the material substance, right? But all in one. And this has had to happen from within the same fuses. The mandala visually encodes the alchemical journey through planetary and elemental correspondences, with the central alchemist figure standing on earth and water, holding fire and air, surrounded by the operations, and culminating in the androgynous unity of opposites as the perfected stone that heals, transmutes, and restores the lost paradisiacal vitality. And so indeed, there is much to think about when making this video. It's interesting that we are approaching some also more biblical ground that we still haven't done that much, but I think it's really what we are rightly heading toward and achieving. I'm very glad that we have the opportunity to cover this stuff, because it takes an incredibly long time to properly do it, right? And we can't simply be doing that so simply, I don't know, in single videos, whatever. Mostly what you learn from the doctrine and the way you learn that truly matters, but it's a great allegory, right? A great way to truly to approach this. Perhaps nobody's ever done this. I don't know how much time you can spend with this. This is summer, by the way, there aren't even so many views, but we do what we can. And in any case, the video is long the way it is. Here I see. So we stop it here for today. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.